Joy Morrissey is Conservative MP for Beaconsfield. Simon Marks is our US correspondent, making a rare trip across the Atlantic. And Dr. Charlotte Proudman is a human rights barrister. They're here to take your calls, 0345 6060 973. And you can, of course, watch us live on Global Player on the LBC website and on the LBC Twitter, Facebook and YouTube channels.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, it's 8 o'clock. 2 more energy firms have collapsed, with a warning more will follow. It's because of rocketing wholesale gas prices. Customers of Avro Energy and Green will be moved to new providers by the regulator. LBC's Lily Keen's been at Green's headquarters in Newcastle.
The two companies combined have more than 800,000 customers between them. Green said in a statement it's blaming the government for failing to provide support to smaller suppliers. It says the price of wholesale gas reaches record highs.
Ministers say the failure of smaller energy providers shouldn't cause alarm or panic. The Prime Minister's admitting Joe Biden's immediate focus isn't a free trade deal between the UK and America. Boris Johnson's been speaking off the back of yesterday's talks at the White House. He says he's making incremental steps to trade with the US. He's also announced the lifting of an American ban on imports of British lamb. And climate change activists are suggesting they'll continue to protest on the M25 in defiance of a High Court order. Members of Insulate Britain say they're prepared to go to prison. It follows 5 days of demos on the motorway in just over a week. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 102 points at 70.83. The pound buys $1.36 and €1.16. LBC weather, blustery rain for the northwest overnight, drier elsewhere, lows of 11. For Thursday, sunny spells across southern areas and wet again in the northwest, highs of 21 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Kev McGraw.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's Wednesday's edition of Cross Question. Joining me on the panel tonight, Alex Salmond, the former Scottish First Minister and leader of the Alba party, Joy Morrissey, Conservative MP for Beaconsfield, Simon Marks, our US correspondent, and Dr. Charlotte Proudman, the human rights barrister. They're here to take your calls. The number to call, as ever, 0345 6060 973. More and more of you are watching us. Goodness knows why, but you are, on the LBC YouTube, Facebook, Twitter feeds, on Global Player and on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, we've had some very feisty discussions over the last couple of days on Cross Question. I suspect tonight is not going to be any different. Let's go to Roger in Windsor for our first question. Roger, go ahead. Hi.
Hi, good evening. Given that Insulate Britain have been closing the M25 and causing mayhem, traffic congestion, and putting lives at risk because of their concerns over carbon dioxide emissions, in the light that if the UK were able to go carbon neutral tomorrow by waving a magic wand, all of those emissions would be replaced by the growth in China's emissions within a few months. Is there any point to those demonstrations?
Well, it's interesting to know that, of course, China today has announced that it won't build any more coal-fired power stations outside China. I think we'll all sit up and notice when they say they won't build any more within China, but there we go. Joy Morrissey.
You stole my point, Iain.
Oh, sorry. I do apologise. I should keep my opinions to myself, shouldn't I?
No, but I was just going to echo what you said, just that China made the announcement today, and it's a really positive step in the right direction. So if China and other sort of world leaders can get on side, there's hope for all of us.
But do you think that's likely? President Xi is unlikely to be attending the COP26 summit in November, we're told. But without China and India in particular, and of course the United States, nothing really is going to change, is it? I mean, we can make signals in this country. We can cut our carbon emissions, but in the wider scheme of things, it's not going to make an awful lot of difference.
Well, I think the Prime Minister is really trying to engage with India and just strengthening our ties with India, for example, and making sure that the message for COP26 is heard, but also just that need for all of our global responsibility on climate change and how we manage things moving forward is very important. So the Prime Minister is making strides in that field.
Simon Marks, America is crucial to this. Joe Biden is making sort of positive noises. He's said to Boris Johnson that he will commit more money to this fund that Boris Johnson's setting up. He obviously has a very different position than his predecessor on this sort of thing. How do you think his views are going to be important here?
Well, he has a position. I mean, that's the stark contrast with his predecessor, who simply didn't want to talk about climate change at all, and indeed lectured a group of scientists in California at one point and told them that they were wrong, that human behaviour was causing the warming of the Earth's atmosphere. I think that world leaders, the Prime Minister included, have understood that under President Biden, climate change, beyond anything else, genuinely has a whole of government place in his administration. It's not spin. It's not anything other than what it says on the tin. So every time a cabinet minister in his administration comes to the White House, climate change is part of the presentation that they're making. So if you want to make headway with the Biden administration, and I'm sure we'll talk later in the hour about the vast number of areas in which the Prime Minister demonstrably has not made headway with the Biden administration over the last 48 hours.
6060973 if you'd like to pick Simon up on that type of question.
But if you want to make headway with him, you make headway with him in part by focusing on the climate change agenda. I do keep looking at those protests. I mean, it's been striking to me coming here, I've been here for the last couple of weeks, and seeing, particularly the extraordinary reporting that our colleague Rachel Venables has been doing on those protesters. I can't imagine that for a second they would be allowed in the United States to disrupt an interstate highway as they did running onto the M25. I mean, the idea that this has been tolerated for 9 days is pretty astounding when you come here from 3,500 miles away.
Charlotte Proudman.
Well, I mean, we haven't seen the details of the High Court injunction yet, so I think we're all waiting to see exactly what that says.
Why not? Because it was granted this morning, wasn't it? Why do these things take so long?
I mean,
useless lawyers.
Took the words right out of my mouth, but I managed to make a living from it, so I won't complain too much. But look, the climate change is one of the single greatest issues, I think, for the younger generation, of which I'm not quite sure I still fit in that bracket.
I don't know how old you are, but I think you do.
But just about. And I mean, in terms of insulating Britain and making sure that social housing in particular is properly insulated is something that I fully agree with. We need to make sure that people are taken out.
Who's going to disagree with that?
Absolutely.
Nobody is, are they?
No, not at all. I fully agree with the aims and objectives of that, but I think it's like many people have said, it's the way they're going about that, and I'm very concerned now about the harm that could be caused to others who need to use the motorway. And I think we were speaking earlier about a crisis that may be taking place, ambulances, police that need to access the highways and are not able to do so, and I do think that is very concerning.
Alex Salmond.
I basically agree with Charlotte, although you can't have things both ways, of course. You can't say, oh, well, that would never be allowed in the United States, it would never be allowed in China, it's only here they allow it, and then disallow it. I mean, you can't have it both ways. I mean, either people have the right to protest or not. There obviously is a point to the protest because the subject couldn't be more important. Charlotte makes a very fair point about people's safety. There are limits to protests where safety is endangered. But I'll tell you something, President Xi's announcement shouldn't be disregarded just because you don't like China's net. It's a very, very important announcement. And Joe Biden is, of course, and the most enormous improvement on his predecessor. But I've got a theory that the most important announcement today is totally unnoticed, at least in the network news, and that's the INEOS announcement of turning Grangemouth, the biggest polluting plant in Scotland, into a hydrogen-powered plant, and hydrogen virtually a clean burn gas. I mean, only in Britain, of course, could, in the middle of a world climate crisis, have a CO2 shortage. I mean, it's incredible when you think about it. One of the many advantages of splitting methane into carbon dioxide and hydrogen One, of course, is you can have the hydrogen, clean burn economy and power all sorts of things in a much, much more climate-friendly way. But the second thing is you have a ready supply of CO2, and you wouldn't have to depend on fertiliser plants closing down to provoke a food crisis. But I'm still struck by the fact that, I mean, I watched the business, I watched the business committee, I think it was, this morning, House of Commons turned it on. And all this procession of people coming on and saying, oh, well, it couldn't have been foreseen. It was really a great surprise. You know, they get ahead of Ofgem and all the rest of it. I mean, why couldn't it have been foreseen? Why is it a great surprise?
Well, because apparently,
it's ridiculous.
I was interviewing someone from the Oil and Gas Trade Association earlier on, and he was saying that 18 months ago, the price of gas was at an all-time low, and the industry didn't see it coming.
Well,
so you can forgive maybe politicians for not seeing it.
Many generations ago, and these things you've got to conceal now. I was an oil...
You didn't foresee the collapse in oil prices.
Yes, but I knew that oil prices were volatile, Ian. I just didn't recognise which way the volatility was going. I mean, therefore, for the head of Ofgem to say, my God, gas prices have quadrupled in the last... This is astonishing. I mean, one of the things about hydrocarbons is the prices are very volatile. This much we know, and therefore, shouldn't there be a provision, a contingency, to make sure you don't at least run out of CO2? 20 years ago and more, I was on an Energy Select Committee which warned about the, quote, dash for gas. So it wasn't just a matter of people should have seen it last month. It was foreseen 20 years ago, but nothing was done about it.
Odd, Joy, is that Britain still produces 50% of its gas needs. Now, France doesn't, I don't think. Germany might have a bit, but not an awful lot. If we produce 50% of our own gas, then why on earth do we have this massive problem? Now, other countries have got the problem too, but surely we should be in a better position.
And I think we are moving in a better position, and we're protecting the consumer, and we're keeping the tariffs in place, and we're, putting things in place to protect the consumer from any changes. But I think internally the market within this sector needs to sort of sort itself out in a way.
But the smaller energy companies are saying that it's precisely because of the energy cap that they have failed. Now, I would say it's possibly because they were slightly ambitious in the prices that they were charging to customers, but that played a part as well. But they're effectively blaming the government.
I think you have to look at the market forces that there was quite a lot of sort of cutting below market value when gas prices were at their lowest and sort of locking people in, and they made that choice to attract new consumers, and now there's this situation. Now the consumers will be protected, the government will step in to protect the consumers, but the market themselves, the businesses internally need to sort of sort themselves out.
I was going back to our caller, but he's not there anymore, so I won't. I'll go back to Simon. Is there anything in the United States that's analogous to this?
Well, there is. I mean, there is, and there are dangers and warnings from the United States that I think the UK has to be very, very careful to learn from the lessons that America has demonstrated. I mean, I was thinking about it today. I've not lived here for 28 years. When I did live here, the nice man from Eastern Electricity came round and he knocked on the door and he took the meter reading, and you went away and you got your bill, and there was never any real question about the price of electricity or the price of gas. I mean, that was the way life worked. And now you're suddenly, and I've been trying to understand it today, absolutely mired in this market, almost deregulated market. If you look at what happened in Texas last year after the flooding there with the electricity power cuts that occurred, and the realization that people had in Texas to some degree, but outside Texas nationally, that there was no federal ability whatsoever to regulate those power companies in Texas. And you had people at home who had managed to retain power during the course of the flooding, switched their lights on, were watching TV, going about their normal business. And instead of getting bills for $300, we're getting bills at the end of the month suddenly for $16,000, $25,000, wow, with no right to appeal, absolutely no ability to undo those bills and turn them over. That is a deregulated market gone crazy. I'm not suggesting you've got that here, but it is...
Ofgem may be useless, but it wouldn't be that
It's
useful.
Definitely a lesson, right? It's definitely a guardrail.
Right, we've got an allied question to this from Chris in Richmond. Hi, Chris, go ahead.
Hello there. Good evening, panel. Can Boris Johnson, with a straight face, lecture any other country about climate change when he couldn't even be bothered to vote against a third runway at Heathrow Airport?
Well, he was Foreign Secretary at the time. I suppose that might be a mitigating factor, but he had a subsequent engagement, didn't he, Alex? He went on a trip to Afghanistan for the Dutch.
Yes, he decided that Afghanistan was safer than facing his constituents. Because, you see, before he didn't vote against it, he said, no, you'll correct me, he'd lie on the runway. Just to stop the
lie in front of the bulldozers. Was
the bulldozers? That would have been nice. Instead of that, he bulldozed that Brexit wall, and the Boris Johnson. I think Boris Johnson. It would take a great deal, to embarrass Boris Johnson. I think he's incapable of. I think that's one of his
rather
great
like yourself.
Strengths. Well, possibly.
Yeah, I was just.
That's what you found the only thing I have in common with Boris Johnson.
Charlotte, what's your view on Chris's point?
Well, I mean, I just want to think about sort of, I suppose, the wider question of this and thinking about climate change, the energy crisis, food shortages, food poverty. And, I work with so many clients that are either in receipt of legal aid or completely on the breadline and really struggling. They tell me how difficult it is to make a choice as to whether they feed their children or they pay for electricity or they pay for other energy. And they describe to me how they have to go to the supermarket in order to top up for their electricity or their gas because they can't afford, as you and I perhaps afford, to pay for monthly electricity or gas bills.
I'm not a rich lawyer.
Yes. Not all human rights lawyers are fat cats, I promise you, Ian.
Most of them are.
But, they're really struggling on the breadline. This is only going to hit them so much harder, along with the universal credit cut as well to their benefits, £20 a week worse off. And the fact that so many privileged people say, well, it's just £20 shows the level of privilege that they have. But actually seeing around the corner from where I live, people queuing up outside a food bank, the absolute indignity of that, of seeing young mothers with their children who can't afford to make ends meet, let alone to be able to put food on the table for their children. I think it's shameful in 2021, especially when thinking about the UK, one of the world's biggest
slightly
economies.
Off the subject, Charlotte.
I mean,
all valid points.
I think it's all so relevant though. It's almost like the perfect storm of everything coming together, and it's going to be the winter of discontent. You heard it first here, Ian.
I remember the winter of discontent. Simon.
So I remember the winter of discontent as well, and I also remember right off the back, I think, of the winter of discontent, a series that aired on ITV at the time. I may be the only panellist old enough to remember it, called Breadline Britain. It was an absolutely stunning series of documentary films about poverty in the UK. And for the first time, I think, really in the modern era, conveyed to millions of viewers what the experience of living in poverty was like.
But there have been, that's an interesting point, but there have been programmes like that since then.
No, but then
the broadcasters are accused of broadcasting poverty porn.
But then you fast forward just to 10 days ago, and that ITV news series about squalor in the United Kingdom. You see people like Martin Lewis, the financial analyst, warning within the last 24 hours that by the time winter comes, there will be households in this country that have to choose, as he put it, between eating and heating. And that's pretty extraordinary when you think of it panoramically going back, 40-odd years.
I don't know how we've got onto this from Heathrow expansion, but Joy Morrissey, would you like to bring us back on track here? Chris's question was all about Boris Johnson lecturing others about climate change when he couldn't even be bothered to vote against the Heathrow expansion.
Well, I did oppose the Heathrow expansion, but I wasn't an MP at the time, so I guess it doesn't count. But I opposed it just for the environmental impact, and also being a West Londoner at the time, I just didn't feel that it was necessary.
And of course now, with the fact that the aviation industry is going to take quite a long time to revert to pre-pandemic levels, if it ever does, that the business case for that runway is kind of, it's a bit like HS2. You kind of think, well, but is it too late? In HS2, I think it is too late to reverse it, but maybe I
chimed in just in case it wasn't in the Westminster Hall debate against HS2, just in case there was a chance.
I've just seen today that you've been promoted. You're now a PPS, where
Barely.
you have to support the government in all that.
This is true. I was told I'm hanging by a thread.
Alex Salmond, very quickly. No, actually, you've had a go on this, haven't you? Chris, let's come back to you.
Well, no one's really sort of clearly given an answer as whether Boris.
I know that's my fault. Blame me. Terrible chairman.
No, I don't blame you, Ian, but I'm particularly interested in Joy's view. She opposed Heathrow Airport. Does she think her boss was wrong? And, does she think he's a hypocrite? I know she's going to say no, but...
Hang on. She's just been appointed a PPS. Be fair. You know she can't say that, even if she might sort of think it. So I'm going to give her a free pass on that, even though Twitter will go mad and say, oh, typically Iain Dale standing up for his Tory mates. Anyway, unless you want to respond, Joy?
I'm fine.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Right, we'll move on. Lots of questions coming in. 0345 6060 973. It's 90 minutes past 8.
LBC.
We all
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
22 minutes past 8. It's Cross Question with Alex Salmond, Joy Morrissey, Simon Marks and Dr. Charlotte Proudman. Let's go to our next question. It's from Mike in Beverley. I think you were on last night, Mike, but welcome back. Well, you've got a good question, though. What is it?
Night before last, Ian. During the Brexit debate, the Leave campaign made great play of the fact that if we left the EU, we could offset any losses with a free trade agreement with the US. Now, given that they're more important to us than we are to them, does the panel think that we'll ever get a serious free trade agreement with the US?
Simon Marks, I think the reporting on this has been quite interesting today, hasn't it? Because it's been a little bit all over the place, but you give your perspective.
I've not been all over the place, Ian.
But you haven't been reporting on it. I have
consistently said on the Iain Dale radio programme, going back now a year, that there was no prospect of a US-UK free trade deal with Joe Biden as president, and that I'm not quite sure why anyone is surprised by where we find ourselves. I do think we find ourselves in a bit of a Monty Python situation. I mean, mean, the idea that we now realise that the US-UK free trade deal is going nowhere, so the government sort of starts postulating that there might be a possibility of the UK joining the USMCA, that's the free trade deal between the United States, Mexico and Canada that replaced NAFTA, is absolutely laughable.
Why?
Because
we've just done a deal with Australia and America. Why shouldn't we do that?
It's even less conceivable that there might be, because the level of negotiation that would take to reopen that trade deal, there's not any traction for that on Capitol Hill. Indeed, leading members, one prominent Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee saying yesterday he'd never even heard the idea floated on Capitol Hill, to say nothing of the negotiation that it would then also entail in Ottawa and Mexico City. It's a complete non-starter, along with the idea that perhaps if the United States goes back into the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, then somehow Britain can join Joe Biden's very short coattails. And it's a non-starter. It's dead in the water. And the only surprise to me is that there's any surprise over the fact that Boris Johnson got his deal on lamb, done the deal on beef, done the deal on whiskey, but that's it. There is not going to be an all-encompassing free trade agreement because Joe Biden has no interest in prioritising it, and even if he did, there's no conceivable way that deal would get through Congress this side of the Biden administration coming to an end.
Charlotte.
Well, I'm completely lost, I suppose, by what's actually happening in terms of international trade agreements or deals potentially, because from what I understood from the Leave campaign, it would be fairly easily and would be swiftly done, and that we could have international trade deals with other countries. And I thought that the US was almost perfectly aligned with this. And it seems almost as if we've been lied to in the way in which it's been presented to the public, because now we've arrived at a position where we're outside of Europe. We're struggling following Brexit with food shortages, difficulties in imports and exports, and it seems as though a trade deal with the US isn't on the cards. And I suppose it's not quite explained, I think, clearly enough in the media as to why that is and what the solution is if we're not going to be able to have the international trade agreements that we thought that we would on leaving the European Union.
Not lied to by Barack Obama, who came here and made it absolutely clear that you weren't going to get a free trade deal.
No,
you will be at the back of the line.
But am I not right in thinking that it's not just us, that Biden's not doing trade deals with anybody?
He has been
But I mean,
consistent
the way some people are reporting it's specifically us
everybody.
doing one.
It's clear that were he doing trade deals, Britain would not be at the front of the line. But he's not doing trade deals because he argues what he wants to do is focus on American job creation and building back better. The phrase that he stole from the Prime Minister, by keeping investments and creating jobs at home. So it's just not on his radar screen with anyone.
Alex Salmond.
Well, Simon's analysis is spot on. Bertie Ahern, the former Irish Taoiseach, once put it to me that he could see the logic in a Brexit Britain wanting to do trade deals. He just couldn't see the logic in them giving up the ones they already had before they did it, which, of course, is what Britain has done. It's given up its position within the single marketplace without securing key deals which could have taken its place.
Well, just on that, though, I've been quite surprised in how many of those deals have been rolled over. In fact, I think they virtually all have, and the Japan one is actually an improvement on the EU deal.
Indeed, but if you look at the percentages, Ian, you'll find you're still some way short of the position that we already had in the single marketplace. And one of the things I've never really been able to understand about Brexit was, if you're going to have Brexit, then why did you want to give up so easily that position in the single marketplace, which wasn't a sacrifice, it was an advantage.
It's a bit like, just for argument's sake, I suppose, that if Scotland gave up membership of the UK single market, that would be mad, wouldn't it?
Well, indeed, but Scotland wouldn't wish to give up its position in the marketplace. And what I couldn't understand about the Brexiteers, I can understand the politics of it. I could understand, the European Union can be a right pain in the butt. I can understand all that. What I could never understand is why you want to give up your position in a single marketplace, which of course was the creation of your enormous heroine, Margaret Thatcher, more than any other single politician.
God rest her soul.
God rest her soul, indeed. Now, I agreed exactly with Simon's analysis until last week, and I want to get this right, when I heard about the AUKUS Defence Pact, which may or may not commit the United Kingdom to the defence of Taiwan. I'm not sure. Theresa May asked that question last week and didn't get an answer. In fact, she was only...
She knew she wouldn't.
Well, she was the only opposition MP, I thought, last week. She was the only person of all the people in the House of Commons who asked Boris Johnson the straight question.
But don't you think, as a former Prime Minister, that was a really odd thing to have done?
No.
If she had been in his position, she would have turned around and given Boris Johnson a death stare.
As we say in Scotland, there's no love lost. There's no love lost there. But nonetheless, it doesn't stop it being an excellent question. And shame on all the opposition who couldn't bring themselves, none of them, to ask a decent question.
No, Ian Blackford's terrible, isn't he?
He's not the only one. So I thought, I knew obviously Johnson was going to America, and I thought there must be some reason why you'd commit yourself strangely to this Asian Defence Pact. And then I thought, it must be something to do with the American trade deal. But I realised I've greatly overestimated the political nous of Boris Johnson and probably underestimated the importance of Joe Biden's Irish heritage. That's what I did. And I thought Biden today, when he made his position on the Irish protocol extremely clear and connected it with a question on the trade deal, did actually underline Simon's point. There ain't going to be any trade deal with the UK anytime soon. And whether you call it the queue or the line, whatever it might be, Britain's at the back of it.
Absolutely. Joy Morrissey, Charlotte had a point, didn't she, that the government and Brexiteers did say that, well, we have all these marvellous trade deals and that will counter some of the trade losses that we will inevitably encounter with the EU. Hasn't quite worked out like that, has it?
I think we've been very successful at pursuing trade deals around the world, and actually Liz Truss, before she switched to Foreign Secretary, was doing a very, very good job.
So why take her out of that job if she was doing it so well?
I think she's doing a fantastic job in what she's doing now, but it was she just got on with the job of securing trade deals across the world. And since I've become an MP, I've sort of banged on about this from the back benches about how instead of with America, I always felt that we should just go for just bespoke issues, not issue specific, but sector specific things, like with the film industry, a deal about film industry, things that actually benefit us in terms of bespoke trade and bringing in states like California or things like that, but making it not about anything that is, like you said, because that just wasn't on the cards, but playing to our strengths and playing to a relationship that also doesn't undermine. Biden is very focused, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, about looking and protecting the workers, the unions, making sure that, because NAFTA previously really undermined the workers, the factories, those kind of things. And so he is very focused on protecting those jobs in the Rust Belt and making sure that no international trade affects that. I would say...
Which is exactly why a trade deal would have so much difficulty in Congress. I mean, Biden's got to worry about the progressive left-wing flank within the Democratic Party as well. But to go to Alex's point, all of this tells you almost as much about Joe Biden as it does about Boris Johnson. Joe Biden spent the week insisting he's the man who wants relationships and alliances,
particularly with
international partners, particularly with that guy down under, right? But when push comes to shove, something that really matters to the UK, a country with which, through AUKUS, he's got a new kind of relationship, no give whatsoever. And that is a problematic issue for Biden himself, because it suggests that there really isn't a Biden doctrine that you can identify. There is this talk of international alliances and partnerships, lots of talk, very little delivery.
I think the explanation for AUKUS is very simple. Anything that annoys the French and the Chinese at the same time, job done for Boris Johnson, I suspect.
Well, the traditional enemy.
Indeed. Old enemy. And that's you, isn't it?
The old alliance.
Oh, wait.
Old enemy.
Anyway, we may go on to other subjects related to that in a moment. Keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:32. Kevin McGrath has the news headlines.
Timor energy firms have collapsed with a warning more will follow. It's because of rocketing wholesale gas prices. Customers of Avro Energy in Green will be moved to new providers by the regulator. Ministers say the failure of smaller energy providers shouldn't cause alarm or panic. The Prime Minister is admitting Joe Biden's immediate focus isn't a free trade deal between the UK and America. Boris Johnson's been speaking off the back of yesterday's talks at the White House. He says he's making incremental steps to trade with the US. He's also announced the lifting of an American ban on imports of British lamb. And climate change activists say they'll continue to protest on the M25 in defiance of a High Court order. Members of Insulate Britain claim they're prepared to go to prison. It follows 5 days of demos on the motorway in just over a week. LBC weather, blustery rain for the northwest overnight, drier elsewhere, lows of 11. For Thursday, sunny spells across southern areas and wet again in the northwest, highs of 21 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36, Anne just texted in, wow, the great man Simon Marks is there in person. Can you tell him that he's an awesome political correspondent? He's increased my interest in politics. Wish him all the best from me. You've got a fan. And Chris says, Iain, can you remind us what the role of a PPS entails? Well, we have one here, Joy Morrissey. Now, they're known as sort of ministerial bag carriers.
Bag carriers, that's
but it's the first rung on the greasy pole to promotion, isn't it?
The very bottom rung. It's like the gutter, basically.
Yeah, but you're one up from a backbencher. So
crawled your way out.
You are effectively your minister's voice in the Commons. You pick up the gossip,
I do.
feed it back.
Yes.
So
many chats across the board from colleagues in the repatriation effort. I met all the colleagues in the SNP and Labour and the Lib Dems.
So which department are you in?
I'm now in Justice.
Right.
As of yesterday.
So you're Dominic Raab's PPS.
I am, yes.
And also, you can create headlines if you resign.
That's true.
Because even a PPS resignation is greeted by headlines.
Well, let's
Good
just
to hold that in the back of my mind.
Let's just remind
if it's
everyone who's on the panel.
today.
Alex Salmond is here, Joy Morrissey, Conservative MP for Beaconsfield, Dr. Charlotte Proudman, human rights barrister, and Simon Marks, our US correspondent. Right, Simon in Chelsea has a very important question to ask. Hello, Simon.
Good evening, and good evening to everybody that's on the panel. My question is, do we think that it's acceptable in this day and age that a female inmate at the age of 18 was forced to give birth to a unborn child on her own, with no medical help, no nurse, no medical equipment, and she was left to do it on her own, and basically lost her baby. She's in prison. She's obviously done something wrong to end up in prison. She shouldn't have just been left there like an animal to give birth to. How terrifying would that have been for an 18-year-old to give birth to a child and not to have anybody there with her, family, friends, or even medical staff? And I think it's absolutely disgusting that this poor woman's been treated the way that she's been treated.
Let me put that to our panel. Charlotte, you do a lot of work in the sort of gender-based violence area of the law. I must admit, when I heard about this case this morning, I thought, this is 2021. How can this happen in 2021? I know prisons are supposed to be sort of fairly Spartan places, but just as a basic human right, if you're pregnant, you deserve to have the same birth as anybody would outside, surely.
Yeah, of course you do. Just because you're a prisoner, it doesn't mean you're a second-class citizen or your property, and therefore you're not entitled to medical treatment like anybody else. And as Simon said, this is an 18-year-old woman, a teenager, that gave birth to a child who died in a prison cell because she wasn't likely given medical treatment, or she wasn't even offered that medical treatment. She didn't give birth in hospital like most other people did, or have midwives around her making sure she had access to necessary medical care. She was all on her own. And not only that, she was told before she gave birth that her baby would be taken away from her. And it seems as though from the report she was suffering, understandably, with an awful lot of depression and anxiety as a result. The report that's been released and published has been very critical of the way in which prison staff and the prison institutionally treated her. And in fact, there are many other cases of women that haven't been given access to medical care in the way in which they required when they were pregnant or indeed gave birth. So it seems as though it's quite deep-rooted and institutional in the way in which it's set up. And so women are being failed, but it's having an enormous impact upon their bodies, upon their health, and their unborn children and their children when they are born. I think it's absolutely appalling. It's disgraceful. It's reprehensible. I don't think there are any words or language that can quite put into words how horrendous this is for this young woman. And I've represented myself young women who have been in prison, who have lost their children in the care system, or have been fighting, tooth and nail to be able to keep their children so that when they come out of prison, they can rebuild their lives and look after them. And I just want to also add that many of the women that I have represented that have gone to prison themselves have been victims of domestic abuse. And because of that, have often ended up in a life of crime. I think it's important to recognise this, because I don't often support carceral punishment, which means prison sentences for women that commit petty theft or petty crimes, but instead need support and rehabilitation. And the woman in this case, the 18-year-old woman, she herself had a very difficult life as a young girl and had been subject to a lot of traumatic circumstances within her family and home life. And then to see the state fail her is just horrendous. And I think that we need to learn some serious lessons from this.
Joy Morrissey, prisons come under the Justice Department. Do you accept that this was a failure of the state?
Well, this is such a heartbreaking situation. I mean, it breaks my heart to hear the story and to see no one should have to go through that. I mean, that's a terrible experience, even just losing a child, but then being alone in that process and being so scared. And I visited a lot of prisons before when I worked at the Center for Social Justice. And what you said about women and reoffending is actually quite accurate, because there's something statistically where women sometimes go in for low-level crimes but then continue to be caught in a cycle of reoffending. Their children are often removed. And it's a very unique set of circumstances for a lot of women offenders that is different in terms of they don't have a family to come back to. Usually that's been completely gone because of their time in incarceration. And they have very unique sets of challenges, often for low-level crimes, and then they just keep entering the criminal justice system. So there is something, intervention and also support that needs to be given to help break the cycle of reoffending. But it is a very complex issue, and it's a smaller amount than the male offenders, but it is a very acute issue.
The thing is, I would have thought that each prison would have a procedure document for what happens when they have a pregnant prisoner and what happens in the lead up to the birth and when the birth happens. Now, I haven't read this report, so I don't know the details, but you would have thought that ought to be the case.
Well, I'm about to find out. Just for my 24 hours of justice.
You are on day one, so I can't ask
but
you. But
I think it's something that female prison, offenders and the issues that I saw at my time at Center for Social Justice have stuck with me more than anything. I mean, just the level of, I felt, not injustice, but they just were failed by the system oftentimes. And
Alex, when you were First Minister, you obviously had responsibility for the prison system as well in Scotland. Do you recall any sort of similar situations here where you just thought to yourself, well, I can't understand how this can happen in the 21st century?
Yeah, I can actually, and nobody could pick the case better or more passionately than Charlotte has just done. About 10 years ago, maybe just over, I opened the new Glasgow Sheriff Court building as First Minister, and they were showing me how their new all singing, all dancing computer system worked, and they said, we'll pick out a case at random for you. And the case they picked out was a young woman who had been jailed for stealing a teddy bear just before Christmas, obviously for one of her children. And the case had a huge effect on me. It still has, actually, when I think about it. Now, in fairness to the sheriff who'd made the disposal, it was quite clear she'd had a range of other stealing offences. That he'd probably done it actually as an act of kindness in terms of keeping her safe over the Christmas period, because she was in a very dangerous situation with pimps and various other things. But I made up my mind then that firstly I thought short sentences were extremely bad ideas, and so we moved to outlaw them in Scotland for everybody, but particularly for women. And secondly, on examination, the vast majority of women at that time in Scotland who were in prison for petty larceny, for crimes associated with prostitution, drugs, and the victims of pimps, as Charlotte rightly said, people who'd been victims of violence themselves and retaliated against male violence. And Scotland went on a pathway, which I hope we're still on, to close Cordon Vale, which is our only female prison. Now, there'll always be people who need to be in prison, but the number of women in that category are very, very small fraction of the number of women.
But if you close a prison, what happens to those
I was coming to that.
Prison?
The proposal was examined properly, and the proposal was to turn Cordon Vale into effectively a safe unit structure. So not a full-scale prison, but safe units. But also an experiment with what were called safe houses. And I spoke to some of the women who were transferred into that environment, and for many of them, it was the first time in their lives they'd been in a place of safety. Not like a prison, but a place of safety. And then what I would say, because one of the women I spoke to gave birth in that safe house environment, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with that as a place of birth. So all I would do is I would commend you, since you're now involved in the Justice Department down here, to take a look at what progress has been made in Scotland. I'm not saying it's perfect, and incidentally there'll be cases like the one that's been cited in every prison system. But I do think that we should be on a pathway to question whether it's necessary to have women's prisons full stop, and whether it cannot be accommodated in a different way.
I can sense a phone-in coming on that in a future programme. Simon?
Well, I would just make one very brief point, that there's something encouraging about this conversation, and there's something encouraging about the fact that Simon asked the question, because it reminds you that this is a country that has had as a social hallmark for centuries the concept of prison reform. And I live in a country that doesn't have that as its hallmark at all, where prison is absolutely punitive and not about rehabilitation. And we're seeing similar things taking place, of course, on the border to the south between the United States and Mexico. So there is something positive about having this conversation and reminding yourself that this is a country where the whole concept of prison reform remains a live issue and not something that's just, part of sort of Elizabeth Fry ancient history.
Great. We'll take more questions in a moment. It's 8:47.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Are you in receipt of prescriptions for 5 or more drugs, treatments, medicines, pills, whatever it might be? 15% of the population are. This has taken the bill to £9 billion, a tenth of which are unnecessary. How many times have I said how much money could be saved by putting in professional accountants within the NHS? When all these campaigns, we need more money for the NHS. What you need is the correct way to spend it.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With the British Airways American Express Accelerating Business Card, check out the world.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:51. Alex Salmond, Joy Morrissey, Dr. Charlotte Proudman and Simon Marks with us. A text question from James in Watford. If an individual makes an allegation of sexual assault, should the person be believed at face value, or should we be investigating these things more closely? Charlotte?
Well, I think that people are properly investigated for sexual assault or rape cases, and of course that should be the right approach. People are presumed to be innocent unless proved guilty or otherwise. But actually, I think kind of the question is framed in the wrong way when you look at the fact that the UK has the lowest conviction rates for rape that they've ever had in this country, and 85,000 women are raped and sexually assaulted in the UK every single year. So that's 9 women, almost 10 women every single hour are raped. and the police are not properly investigating rape and sexual assault cases. And we've seen the government themselves that have looked at this in detail and produced a report showing exactly that, the systemic failures of the police, coupled with a super complaint made by the Centre of Women's Justice to the police, rightly so, for the police not properly responding to allegations of domestic abuse and other forms of sexual assault within the police force itself. So how on earth can we put trust and faith in the police and properly investigating these types of crimes when they're potentially committing it behind closed doors in their own homes? So I think that the question, whilst I understand the purpose of it and making sure it's properly investigated, I don't even think we have that at the moment, unfortunately. And I see so many women clients myself that come to me, they say they've been raped, they say they've been sexually assaulted, and I ask them, why didn't you go to the police? And they say to me, because I don't think I'll be believed, or I don't want to go through the trauma of being cross-examined within a criminal court, even if it gets that far. And let's remember, most of them don't get that far. But that whole process is incredibly re-victimising and re-traumatising for them.
It's interesting the way that James puts it, saying, should the person be believed at face value? Because in all the inquiries into cases of historic child abuse, for example, the police have taken an approach there where they have automatically believed the allegation. And of course that has come to bite them rather unfortunately, hasn't it? Because there have been so many cases where they were fantasists.
Well, I mean, you look at how many, the minority of cases that have been, as you put it, fantasists or have been found to be incredible. I mean, the Home Office did a report on this and they estimated that only around 2 to 3% of rape claims are actually false. The majority of those are true and they're not being properly investigated. I don't think the way forward in making sure they are properly investigated and perpetrators are brought to justice is just by believing people necessarily at face value. I think it's the police's approach to looking at these types of offences. I just want to add that 1.6 million women in our country suffered domestic abuse in 1 year, and that was particularly during the COVID pandemic. And what did the police do about that? Absolutely nothing, and it's shameful. Domestic abuse is terrorism on a mass scale. It's insidious and it's corrosive. It not only affects women, it affects children on an intergenerational level, and the police are systematically failing them.
And we should point out it also affects men too, but obviously not as much.
Of course it does, and
Simon.
that's important to point out. Thanks, Iain.
Simon.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure that. I mean, Charlotte is, far more steeped in these issues.
But is this a live issue in the States?
It is a live issue in the States. I mean, it's a live issue in the States, of course, that has been surfaced as a result of the entire Me Too campaign. And it's a live issue in US-UK relations right now because of the allegations that have been levied against the Duke of York, to which there still has been no official response, and now this legal debate about whether he's officially been served papers or not legally as part of the civil case that is trying to proceed against him in New York. But yes, it is absolutely a vibrant issue in the United States, and there too, as Charlotte was saying, we've seen as a result of COVID a vast increase in domestic abuse and in calls on the police to investigate and take those reports seriously.
Can I just say about the Duke of York point? Thank you for raising that. I think it's a really important point to emphasise. We need to make sure that nobody is above the law and that people in positions of power, even if they're part of the monarchy, they are subject and they face justice just like anybody else. They can't escape it just because of the position that they're in. I appreciate it's an allegation, but if he is to be served with papers, and it seems that he's trying to wiggle his way out of being served with papers, then it's right that he faces the questions that anybody else accused of this type of crime would face.
Alex Salmond, you've faced some of these questions over the last few years. Do you feel that the justice system worked for you?
Well, I could write a book about that, and
I suspect you might.
But on Charlotte's point, I mean, there's problems in terms of the police and institution, and they should be rectified. I mean, that's clear. As far as the Duke of York's concerned, then he should face the charges that have been made against him in the civil courts, or potentially in other courts as well. I mean, he's got no choice. I mean, he's bound to do that, as indeed the judge indicated when the case came up last week or so. The only thing I'd say is, look, once people do face charges, and once the jury delivers its verdict, then it should be accepted. And I, obviously for personal reasons, but for other reasons, I don't like trial by media. Never have. And I don't like people who question juries' verdicts. So I take care that I wouldn't. Instead, when I was a backbench MP, I don't know if this is but no, you're not a backbench MP, of course. I was constantly phoned up, back in the day by the tabloids saying, such and such a jury has done such and such, isn't that disgraceful, etc., etc. And I always refused to do it because obviously no MP, no person, no journalist likely can hear what a jury's heard. And therefore you have to have confidence in the essence of the system, and once the verdict's in, it should be accepted.
Can I just come back on that? I mean, I think it's an important point about having confidence in the system, but I don't think that many people do have confidence in the system because in the way in which it's currently delivered, because of the very low conviction rates and prosecution rates for rape, and because the police are not properly investigating it. I mean, as I say, we have a super complaint by the Centre for Women's Justice itself. I don't support trial by social media, and I understand that, of course, that's incredibly problematic, and that we do need a functioning justice system so that people do have faith in it, and that women and men who may be victims of domestic abuse or rape will come forward and will seek to make sure that the justice system does properly investigate their complaint. But at the moment, we don't have that. And I think that's what's resulting in the trial by social media and other forms of, I suppose, sensationalisation in the media.
Joy.
I think we have to uphold the justice system when someone has been taken to court and to trial and the jury has come back with a verdict. What I have seen as an interesting and somewhat troubling trend is when the verdict comes back that isn't, or the police investigation or whatever, doesn't come back in the way that the person who has made the allegation wants. They just sort of try to take it to a different media outlet or another avenue. And I believe very strongly in standing up for child sexual exploitation. And for children, I have a very hard and fast rule. If a child comes forward, you need to believe them on sight. I mean, and my job is to protect the children, disabled people. If someone comes forward, that's it. They're vulnerable. They need our voice. But I think there is nuance and there is abuse that happens to men and women. And there are also vexatious claims that happen. And we have to sort of look at a way forward through this where we don't use this new culture of sort of obliterating each other as the way to sort of, deal with maybe many complex societal issues. So I think that's why we have the courts. That's why we have police investigations. We have those things in place. We should respect those mechanisms.
Well,
can I just say though, and I appreciate it's very quickly, but just 2 weeks ago, there was a man that was sentenced to around 4 years in prison, of which he'll likely serve half his sentence, and he strangled to death and killed a woman who he was having a sexual relationship with and used the so-called rough sex defence, and that's all that he got. He'll serve less than 2 years, around 2 years in prison. Is that all a woman's life is worth? I have no faith in the justice system if that's the kind of sentence that's dished out. Her 2 children now have no mother.
So I will say that the Conservatives, particularly Laura Ferris, she's a backbench MP with in my intake, has just done an incredible job campaigning on this issue, the rough sex issue, and actually was able to change the legislation based on how much she was campaigning on this very, very, and it is a very important, incredibly important topic. And she has been able to change the law based on this one thing. So we can make these changes legislatively, but that's an example of something that actually a backbench MP took up, saw that there was a need in the legislation, and has moved things forward. And I know they feel like small wins, but those are the things, those are the good things. That is the good thing about having a diverse parliamentary party.
Well, 2 very serious discussions in the last half an hour, but I think I've learnt a lot from them. I hope everyone else has too. But we do have a fun text we like to have a fun text.
Taking it back up.
So this is an awkward gear change.
Shall I sing some football?
This is from Neil in Aberystwyth. Netflix have secured the rights to Roald Dahl's estate. What's your favourite Roald Dahl book? No,
Charlie,
somebody say
Factory.
I know, I was thinking exactly the same.
I have never read a Roald Dahl book, but I used to religiously watch Roald Dahl programs, and it was the one where the person got their fingers cut off, finger by finger. Now, I know it's gruesome, but it was awfully good. So I commend the finger-cutting Roald Dahl story.
Yeah.
Simon?
I'm going to be very dull and say Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I think.
All right.
Well, I'm just going to... I mean, people listening won't
seeing a lot
get
of
this, but I'm going to do Tales from the Unexpected. You're too young for this, but Anglia Television made Tales from the Unexpected, and it must be on YouTube somewhere. I wasn't in it, but I could have been. Listen, I think this has been one of the best cross questions we've ever had, so you'll all be invited back very regularly. Thank you very much indeed. If you've missed any of the programme, you can catch up on the Cross Question podcast, or you can watch it again on YouTube on the LBC channel. Alex Salmond, Joy Morrissey, Charlotte Proudman and Simon Marks. We'll see you again soon. In a moment, we're going to be talking about Keir Starmer. He wants to have a row with his own party. Is that the way to really get voters back to vote Labour, to indulge in a bit of navel-gazing? Want your opinions in a moment. It's 9:03.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9:03, more than